Good evening, everyone. I'm Polly Carpenter, Director of Public Programs at the Boston Society for Architecture. Welcome to the third event in Architecture in Dialogue, a webinar series and digital exhibition organized by the BSA and the Aga Khan Council and co-sponsored by the Boston Society for Landscape Architecture and the MIT Department of Architecture. This webinar series highlights and amplifies the Aga Khan Award for Architecture 2017-2019 cycle. You can find the digital exhibition and past event recordings on the BSA website, and links will be in the chat. Tonight, we're thrilled to partner with AIA DC, which is also supporting the award with a digital exhibition. I'll hand it over to Scott Clowney, Director of Exhibitions and Public Programs at AIA DC, to introduce our speakers.
Thanks, Polly. Good evening. On behalf of AIA DC, we're delighted to connect with the BSA and Aga Khan Council on tonight's program. Thanks for having us. Additionally, we're grateful to the Aga Khan Council and the Aga Khan Trust for Culture for their support as we too host a virtual exhibition related to this recent cycle of the Aga Khan Award for Architecture. For those joining us from DC, just a reminder that you can access the exhibition by going to our website. We'll also put a direct link in the chat box. Tonight's program features a moderated panel followed by Q&A with the audience. If you have any comments or questions during the program, please use the chat and Q&A features. I'm delighted to briefly introduce our speakers. Their extended bios will be linked in the chat box. Our moderator this evening is Kristian Kloeckl, Associate Professor of Design and Architecture at Northeastern University, where he directs the Experience Design Lab. He is author of The Urban Improvise and co-author of Workplace and Public Realm. His work has been exhibited at the Venice Biennale, the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and others. Now, on to our speakers. Adnan Morshed is a practicing architect, architectural historian, and professor at the Catholic University of America, with academic focus on history and theory of modern architecture and urbanism, urban poverty and spatiality, ecological urbanism in developing countries, and more. He received his Ph.D. and Master's in Architecture from MIT. Next up, Marianne Ocampo is a principal at Assoc and Associate Professor of Practice in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at MIT. She practices as an urban designer, working on international and domestic institutional and urban projects. Her research focuses on urban design and cultural identity, socio-ecological urban design approaches to resilience, and planning and design for higher education. And finally, Brigitte Shim co-founded Shim Sutcliffe Architects in 1994 in Toronto, Canada. The design practice explores the integration and interrelated scales of architecture, landscape, furniture, and fittings. Brigitte has served on numerous international, national, and local design juries as an advocate for design excellence, including her role as a steering committee member for the 2019 award cycle. Welcome, speakers. Thanks so much for being with us. Kristian, over to you.
Hello, good evening, everyone. Thank you, Polly and Scott, for the introductions and for hosting today's event, the Aga Khan Award for Architecture Thriving and Inclusive Commons. The Aga Khan Award for Architecture is a program of the Aga Khan Trust for Culture, a philanthropic organization that supports a wide range of activities aimed at the preservation and promotion of the material and spiritual heritage of Muslim societies. The award was established by His Highness the Aga Khan in 1977, so 44 years ago, and it is a triennial award that is regarded as one of the most important honors in the field. It is granted to projects that not only celebrate architectural excellence, but that, and this is particularly important, it is awarded to projects that also improve the overall quality of life of the surrounding communities. Through its efforts, the award seeks to identify and encourage building concepts that successfully address the needs and the aspirations of societies across the world in which Muslims have a significant presence. Two of the projects in the last award cycle relate particularly to the topic of today's panel, Thriving and Inclusive Commons. I will give a brief 2-minute overview of each of these projects, and you'll also find links in the chat to these projects. We will then open the discussion with our panelists, taking the projects as a starting point to explore issues of participation and identity in today's broader context of architecture and planning. The first project is the Public Spaces Development Program in Tatarstan, a republic that is part of the Russian Federation. The post-Soviet era brought freedom of movement to the people in Tatarstan and also returned to private real estate ownership. The latter also enabled wealthy individuals and businesses to buy up large areas of land, often limiting the population's recreation options. The Public Spaces Development Program seeks to counter these trends and to offer an environment of equal quality to all citizens. In only 3 years between 2015 and 2018, this program transformed 328 spaces across the entire republic. Project types include water bodies, embankments, parks, squares, and other types. And in all cases, the design and implementation process is based on a strong engagement with local citizens. An architectural office initiated by the program's curator has become a magnet for young, local, and national talent, with many of its recruits moving on to set up their own practices to oversee projects of the program. This following short 1-minute video gives some more insight into the program. Let's run it.
The thing is that basically this whole participatory design, which is now obligatory for any city in Russia to take part in the federal program of developing public spaces, it is obligatory to involve citizens. But it all started here in this very park.
Приходили люди совсем разного возраста, совсем разных профессий, пенсионеры, молодежь. Это одно дело, когда приходит дизайнер или какой-то художник, который имеет природную или приобретенную специальность, или вкус, или умение видеть по-особенному. А приходили совершенно разные люди. И совершенно разные, но интересные предложения вносили, которые мы вместе реализовывали.
In the end, it refers as much also to the architectural concepts, because we are not working to help the architect implement his vision. We are working to make the people happy, and we spend the tax money. So we really should be focusing most on what the people want.
Изменилась не только ментальность наша, население, восприятие, но целая плеяда талантливых, молодых и более старших архитекторов, художников, дизайнеров выросла вместе с этим проектом, и сегодня они уже задают тон в этой большой работе на площадках Российской Федерации.
The same goes also to the producers. When I arrived, there were 12 producers who would do street furniture, and now there are 75 producers who sell to 32 regions of Russia, which means that all the money we put work for the development of the local economy, and they develop new skills. This has been an exercise of growing up community of professionals with experience and with vision and with the shared values.
The second project we're looking at as a starting point for our conversation today is the Revitalization of Muharraq. Muharraq is today Bahrain's third largest city, and it has a history as a global center of the pearling industry. Following the development of cultured pearls in the 1930s, the town went into decline, and Muharraq's indigenous population was largely replaced by migrant workers. The project was initiated as a series of restoration and adaptive reuse of a number of historic buildings before it evolved into a comprehensive program called Pearling Past that involved multiple architects, planners, and researchers. The project highlights the town's pearling history and also aims to rebalance its demographic makeup enticing local families back through improvements to the environment and by providing community and cultural venues. Facilitated by private-public partnerships, the project, that is today a UNESCO World Heritage, involves the preservation of a number of sites and numerous buildings, including humble diverse houses, prestigious courtyard residences, as well as commercial warehouses. It also includes upgrades to building facades and the construction of 4 new buildings. All of these are connected through a visitor pathway with vacant lots landscaped as public spaces. We also have a short video about this project, the Revitalization of Muharraq.
The project being a large urban regeneration project, it entails, apart from the historic buildings that we're seeking to conserve, that we're also rehabilitating. First of all, in very basic things, that we maintain the public areas of the city, the streets, you know, the public realms, the facades, that we really reinvest in this part of the city. And on the other hand, that we reintroduce contemporary programs that maybe were no longer being placed and reinvested in the city. To be honest, there was a bit of challenges at the start because what was being done was somehow new in a sense, and there was a kind of common understanding that these old buildings, you know, were derelict, that it was a waste of money to reinvest in them. And, you know, obviously once the building started having a use, started having a life, started attracting people from other areas of Bahrain, from other areas of the region, that they started, you know, reversing the decline of the city. The impact has been, you know, extremely positive.
There is now a kind of collaboration between formal, informal sectors, private sector, who are all now ignited to do something to preserve and safeguard their own heritage, which is really shows that the inscription had a very positive impact on the community.
الاستثمار هذا النوع من الحرف المحلية وتوظيف الأماكن الأصلية لكي تكون أيضا مصدرا للاستدامة ولطرق أبواب جديدة للعمل. كذلك الحرف القديمة التي بعض منها كاد يندثر، ربما صناعة أو حياكة الكرار، وهي مهنة أصيلة كادت تندثر، الآن عبر تعليم الجيل الجديد ممارسة هذه المهنة وأيضا توظيفها لمدخول ومردود.
The nicest and most surprising thing was also the ease in which people really appropriated these spaces, you know, as soon as they were implemented, you know, and it was really beautiful to see because it was somehow as if these spaces had always been there in the city.
At this point, I'd like to turn to our speakers, and I'd invite Marianne, Brigitte, and Adnan to turn on their cameras. For our audience, please share your questions in the chat at any time of our conversation. I will then bring them up to our speakers during the Q&A session at the end. Both projects stand out for the element of public participation in the planning and the design process, as well as the ability of the public to participate in the completed architectural interventions. Public participation is an important issue in architecture and planning today, and I want to ask you to help us unpack that term a little, to understand what different kinds of participation exist, what are meaningful kinds of participation, and what opportunities but also challenges you see in this regard. And perhaps Marianne, you could kick us off and share your thoughts on this.
Sure, happy to do so. Thank you. I think this is a great question. I think for me, I have found that participation has been a key part of design processes. There's been an increasing effort for architects and designers to really be more inclusive in design processes as we talk about diversity and equity and inclusion in today's kind of professional practice and academic discourses. I think for us, or for me at least, I think that part of this is through this public participation is really thinking about engagement and meaningful engagement. And for me, there's all kinds of ways and methodologies and types of participation that can occur. In some cases, we have in-person analog methods. In other cases, there are kind of digital civic technologies that are emerging for us to really engage with the public, with communities. And so I think that there's a tailoring of participation processes and engagement methods that are really thinking about who we're asking opinions from and who the people are and who we're designing for. I think the types include everything from surveys and questionnaires, mapping experiences, stakeholder interviews, focus groups, site tours, town hall meetings, design workshops, and even kind of post-occupancy evaluations and assessments. For me, I think the most meaningful types of participation and engagement are really focused on building trust between the designer and the community, thinking about active listening and learning, being able to really gather open-ended and kind of specific feedback, following up and having clear communication that is accessible, and really building advocacy and kind of consensus in the way in which the design vision is being formulated. And with that, I think there are pros and cons, I would say, that are really about understanding, the kind of epistemic justice ideas of how we share knowledge, whose knowledge is important, and understanding that the community that we're working within really have a sense of the needs and the context and how that can influence the design kind of project. I think that in a lot of cases, we have to be aware of participatory processes that are, if they're predetermined outcomes that are part of that process, it kind of can really cause a ripple effect that doesn't allow for the participatory part to really come to fruition and influence the project. And I think that we have to be aware of really figuring out how to tailor participatory processes and engagement in a way with the people that we're working with and in that context and condition.
Adnan, do you want to share your thoughts on this?
Sure. Thank you, Kristian. Great question. I agree with Marianne that participation, public participation, is an essential component of any democratic governance. And I would argue that public spaces are one of the best indicators of the democratic health of a country, a nation. So therefore, public participation in the planning of public spaces or in any planning processes is basically a reinforcement of democratic values. So, but I would also argue that public participation can mean many things to many people. In one way, it can mean at a very rudimentary level that as a member of the public, you ought to enjoy, participate, experience, interpret, utilize the public space the way you deem fit, as long as you don't cause any harm to anybody. So I would give you one very quick example of my own travel experience. And once I was in Tiananmen Square in Beijing and Tahrir Square in Cairo. So in both places, I had to be cautious about how I behaved and how I talked to people, how I interacted with people. And I was in Cairo, in Tahrir Square, I was taking some random picture as a tourist, and the security guard showed up out of nowhere and asked me what I was doing there and what was my purpose of taking pictures. I just explained that, I'm a tourist, I'm just taking some random pictures. So that experience made me wary of my situation. And I could not be myself the way I could be in Jamal Fana in Marrakesh or Las Ramblas in Barcelona. So I think not fearing in the public space is an essential component of the participation in the possibilities and promises of the public place. But I would also add one other point, is that public participation, today we celebrate, we encourage public participation in all kinds of analog and digital methods, but it can be both a problem and asset. Asset, of course, we understand how public participation can be asset. It can foster democratic norms and values in the design of public places. But when public participation is bureaucratized and ritualized, it can also suffer from tokenism. But what we need is a kind of meaningful participation that is sustained, effective, and somehow reflected in the planning processes. But I think it would be wise to imagine new kinds of ways of when bottom up and top down, even though top down is a kind of a complicated and rather discarded term, but we have to see how these two, for example, municipal leadership and then general public interact in imagining the fertile spaces of design. And I would end by saying what I do typically in one of my classes, that I ask my students to imagine a conversation, imaginary conversation between Le Corbusier and Jane Jacobs, how they would interact and how they would create the ideal space for public participation. I will stop there.
Thanks, Adnan. And that leads me to my question for Brigitte. We've mentioned before how Brigitte has seen some of the interventions in Tatarstan in person. And now Tatarstan is probably not an environment where there is the risk of tokenization of public participation, rather that did not exist until very recently, and that project was a very brave, bold step in that direction. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that and your observations when you were there.
I mean, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this conversation. I think it's really great that we're linking the whole idea of participatory design, civic involvement, and the Aga Khan Architecture Award program. The two are really, in my view, really interconnected, because in a way, since you described at the beginning that it's been going on for over 40 years, and in the very first program, award grouping was actually a kampong improvement project in Jakarta. And that was really a kind of refuse dump that got turned into a community. So the whole idea of restoration of communities was part of the award program from the very beginning. I was able to visit another project called the Kampong Kali Chode in Yogyakarta in Indonesia, and it received an award, Aga Khan Award in 1990. And in a way, that was also a whole other reclamation project of participatory design, where a Catholic priest moves into a neighborhood, works with artists, and transforms a whole slum hillside into a positive community. Super Killen, which was in the kind of 13th cycle, was a project in Denmark with architects like Bjarke Ingels, working with artists to create, in effect, an amazing public space, a whole redefinition of what participatory design is for that kind of community in Copenhagen. And then we have Tatarstan. So here you have a former Soviet area that is coming into its own. My understanding from some of the people I met there was that there was a beautiful, beloved willow tree. And this willow tree was part of one of the kind of public space projects. And somehow this tree was actually demolished, removed without any consultation. And it really sparked a huge outcry from a citizens group. And in a way, this kind of negative thing of this beloved tree being demolished was really the beginning that this Tatarstan public space development program realized that they couldn't do the same old, and they had to find a different approach. And even the reaction, this negative reaction, was citizen-based. It was really bottom up, and the outcry was so huge that this new group doing this public space had to find a different way of engaging with the public, and maybe starting by asking them first as opposed to telling them what they would be getting. And that shift has been amazing. So when you go through some of the spaces in Kazan, you see kids everywhere playing, you see people strolling in public parks. And in a way, there's a huge variety. So in the video, they were describing that there weren't 2 or 3 people that designed, there were hundreds. And I was really fortunate to visit the University of Kazan in the design studios. And I would say one of the most positive end results of all of this, receiving the Aga Khan Award and this public space development program in Tatarstan is the optimism, the hope, and the kind of positive outlook of a whole generation of younger architects, urban designers, who are actually having opportunities that I would say for previous decades, they couldn't even think of. They were not part of the conversation. So it's kind of unleashed a whole younger generation of really talented designers who feel really empowered to serve their community. So I think the video is very accurate in saying, you know, we actually get to actually make a difference. And we actually get to not, and Natalia was saying in the video that the designers are not designing for themselves, they're actually serving the community. It's a very different starting point. And so I see it as really always part of this program. So I don't see these 2 projects as being atypical. I actually can point to many projects over many decades that have been groundbreaking and super important in terms of this kind of bottom up thinking from way before we even called it participatory design or civic involvement. They were actually already doing it and permeating work that actually did this in different parts of the world. So anyhow, it's and it's such a important program in highlighting not just the end result, but in both cases, the process is as important as the final outcome. The process that each community had to design themselves to get to the purling routes in or to get to this kind of Tatarstan public system are really kind of homemade. They're not like a kind of formula that you apply to this community. They really have evolved over time. And that's really the really important lesson, I think, in this whole conversation that you're initiating, Kristian.
Thanks, Brigitte. And I love your emphasis of how the Tatarstan project really grew out of this very negative experience and negative pushback from the public around the tree cutting down, and how that led to a radical rethinking of the entire foundation of the project. When you say, you know, this project shows an approach that has designers not tell the people what they should want, but asks the people, it leads me to another question. As both the projects touch on issues of identity, place-specific history, as well as notion of public, of what public is. Today now we've become acutely aware that this issue of identity, public, history is not a question of singular terms, but is really a question of plurals, of multiple histories, of multiple identities. And I'm curious to hear from the speakers here, if you can help us understand how architecture can deal with that pluralism of identities, histories, and publics, and engage with them in an architectural and planning process. Marianne, do you want to start us off again?
Sure, I can start. I think that that's a wonderful question, because I think that pluralism is part of how we should think about the built environment, architecture, landscape, urban design, planning. I think that, personally, design is not static. We produce drawings, we produce ways that we're thinking through a process with people. It's not fixed, but it's always in this state of flux. And there can be very distinct conditions of a particular site or community, but there's also this kind of pluralism in that it's also many places at the same time. And so I think that we're constantly oscillating between this sense of change, becoming, flux, and these kind of larger dynamic forces. And so, when I think about the role of the designer and within the world of this kind of pluralism that exists, for me, it's acknowledging that design is in motion and that our work is part of a larger time continuum that is really like comprised of dynamic forces economically, environmentally, politically, culturally, socially, and to be really understanding your positionality within that kind of larger continuum, and that we are at this time, reacting to needs and conditions that we are designing for and with in mind. And so I think that, the needs of the community, the nuance, and the ways in which we are asking and not telling, and that we are understanding multiple, kind of interest, stakeholder perspectives, and knowing that there might be contradictions that are part of the process or competing interests is something that we must understand. Understanding the way that we think about our values, that's being part of a process and part of the design project, is also something that I come to terms with in regards to being very explicit and transparent in understanding. And then I think that there's this kind of associated meaning within the built environment that changes with whoever is using it. But we can start to really understand the kind of multiple stakeholders, again, through listening and understanding how our interventions impact communities. And so what I love about, even the description that you read, Kristian, about the awards is really, it's about, design excellence to me is thinking about how you are improving the quality of life. It's not siloed. Like, to me, excellence is because you are precisely improving the quality of life in the surrounding communities, and, thinking about who you're designing for.
Adnan, I know that your work also relates a lot and reflects a lot on issues of identity or identities. And Marianne has described how this design process is not something static, doesn't happen once, but constantly renews itself. What's your experience in that?
Sure. Kristian, I apologize for my unstable internet. I'm on the other side of the planet, so bear with me, okay? Perfect. It's 4 in the morning here, and so I don't know what's going on. The internet is a little unstable.
We'd love to serve you coffee via Zoom, Adnan.
So the question of identity is intriguing, and identity is never monolithic, nor the notion of the public. These are not monolithic, siloed concepts. That after 3 decades of postmodernism, post-colonialism, and post-structuralism, this sounds like truism, but this is how it is. I'll give you one very quick example. Think about the 2020 BLM movement and its effect. And I'll give you one quick example in my own neighborhood on Capitol Hill in Washington, DC, Lincoln Park. It's a beautiful park in my neighborhood where we all go and take a stroll and watch people and sit and enjoy the trees and green. And at the center of the park, there is a statue, Emancipation Memorial, a towering Abraham Lincoln and a kind of kneeling slave, unshackled. So at the height of the BLM movement last year, all the BLM activists galvanized to this park because this statue, for many of them, symbolize the kind of the racial violence that that persisted for many centuries. But we realized that I was there and I realized that there was no consensus about anything. And there was no monolithic racial blocks that had one way that expressed one view or the other. So there was no one unified Black consensus. So one group said that the statue should go because it kind of visualized the racial violence, and one group said that no, the statue should remain because it is a reminder of the tragic events of the past and one of the fundamental birth defects of America, slavery, right? So, but I was intrigued how the scholarly community responded to the debate of statues in American public places. One, Del Upton, an architectural historian, argued that there is no moral argument could be made against statues that kind of expressed the past experience of racial violence, because no moral argument could be made that evil, because he argued that evil and good exist in every person, so it should be a reminder of the complex histories of America. But then I was also fascinated by the argument of an Oxford archaeologist named Dan Hicks. He said that statues are not just statues. They are embodiment of racial violence. Therefore, they should go. So Society of Architectural Historians, for the first time, I think, made a distinctive position about statues in American public plazas that symbolize racial politics, racial violence. And Society of Architectural Historians argued that statues that symbolize racial violence must be taken down. They are places in the museum to educate people. So what I'm trying to argue is that identity can never be a resolved issue. But what architectural community, design communities need is courage. Courage to confront the complexities and contradictions of history. And I'm reminded of what Maya Angelou once said: history, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again. So I think among the design community, what we need is courage to confront the complexities, contradictions, and unresolvable situations of identity. That's what we need. And I would say my last point would be here is that pluralism in identity, inclusivity in identity is social justice.
Thank you, Adnan. It sounds as if you're suggesting that we need to repeat in conversations and continuous engagement and interactions in order not to repeat actions that had happened in the past, in a certain sense, and how architecture can engage in that process of repeating a question and a conversation in order not to repeat. Brigitte, I want to take this forward from Marianne's and Adnan's point. What came out for me is how identity, society, history, place aren't monolithic and aren't fixed in time, but constantly evolve. Architectural interventions typically happen at a certain moment in time. How can architects and planners ensure that their works remain open enough so that people can complete them over and over again for these interventions and projects to remain relevant for the times these people live in, for the societies that they evolve into, for the identities that reveal themselves in these places?
I think that's a great question. I would say that the second project that we saw on the video in Bahrain is such a great example. So you have this kind of amazing heritage of this pearling economy. And then it sort of disappears because there's a kind of, the economy falls apart when they figure out how to cultivate pearls in other parts of the world. The built fabric is there, new people move in, and there's almost a kind of amnesia, a kind of lack of understanding of the rich heritage of the place. And so in a way, I see that project in this revitalization project in Bahrain is actually really important because it really links this idea of identity with civic pride and civic involvement. The two for me are very interconnected. And so what you have is these new interventions, publicly funded, privately funded, stitched together a kind of new physical route through this heritage part of this town. And they really give you an understanding of this lost history, this history that people didn't remember anymore because there was a kind of turnover in the population. And this investment in the public realm was so important because in a way it improved the quality of life of all of the residents living in this town. And at the same time, it allowed visitors from totally outside places to actually understand this pearling route through the town. And in a way, it was incremental, it's open-ended. And in a way, Noura, who is the kind of was in the video, she was being interviewed, is both an architect, but I see her as a kind of curator of public realm space. And so she's working both as a kind of designer, but she's also helping to shape this new public realm that was sort of already there, but kind of disappeared. And she's actually pulling it back into existence by taking parking lots or misused spaces and turning them into new public spaces, taking buildings or sites that were derelict and actually adding new programs. And so these interventions really provide a whole new way of looking at a city that was already there. It was fabric. So unlike Tatarstan, where you're looking at new public spaces, nothing existed before. We're adding new playgrounds, new parks, new this. Whereas in Bahrain, all of this fabric already existed. And it was just being inhabited by different people who just didn't know what the history was. So now you're actually sharing, in effect, what was already there. And you're doing it through these incremental interventions, but they add up to a bigger story about identity and then connecting identity with both civic involvement, this kind of public process. And at the result of it, from my perspective, is the civic pride that is related to identity. So I feel like this winning project of the 14th cycle is such a great example of this question of identity. It shows it so well, and it's doing it in a different form of intervention. You know, this kind of the contrast, the two projects you've selected are so different geographically. You know, one is in a kind of, they're totally different climatic zones, they're totally different latitudes. They both end up with vital public spaces, but they go about it in totally different ways. You know, from something that existed that is actually where you breathe new life into something that was already there, or you create a process that builds a whole network of public spaces in small towns, big towns across an entire country. So I feel that they're both totally different, but also both really relevant as examples of participatory design in great ways.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Brigitte. And this actually connects directly with a question that was posted on our Q&A panel. So I want to bring that up right away and encourage also anyone that's listening in to post their questions if you have them. We'll be happy to bring them up. Brigitte, you talked about the Bahrain project as a project that reconnects to the memory of place. And this question addresses archival considerations and and asks whether in these kind of projects, like the Bahrain project, there are mechanisms that can or could be employed, or that you're aware of similar kinds of projects that are able to preserve people's stories as they relate to these places and spaces. Bahrain preserves and revitalizes the spaces, the buildings, the structures related to a history. I think this question touches directly on people's stories, narrated stories. Are you aware of projects where there is this linkage made between the architecture of place and the actual stories and experiences of people that this architecture reconnects with? Is this something that is possible? Is this something that can be facilitated? Who wants to take that? Brigitte, yes.
Well, I would say that the Superkillen project in Copenhagen is a very interesting project from in terms of that your question. It's in a kind of peripheral neighborhood of Copenhagen, the greatest number of immigrants in the entire city. And so this kind of group of artists and architects actually went out to the community and asked them what they wanted. And what you have is a collection of, kind of pieces, a kind of fountain from Morocco, or a kind of octopus slide from Japan, or a swing set from a different place. And all of these objects are part of this kind of new public realm. And so many different communities were listened to. And you have this kind of mosaic of kind of both objects within a public field, and it's kind of a very long, extended public realm. And I would say it becomes pretty interesting as a kind of different and new way of considering public space. And again, there's no one great example. There's just many different ways of actually realizing this kind of public realm. We've been in a pandemic for so long and months inside. I would say people value the public realm even more, and especially ones in their own backyard. People, you need somewhere where you can walk to this new public realm, and it should actually serve your needs as a community. And I would say we've had to really reflect a lot on what do we want, where should it be, and why shouldn't there be better facilities, because in a way, these spaces mean so much to all of our communities all around the world.
That would actually be something I'd be quite curious to hear our other speakers' thoughts on. You brought up COVID, the pandemic, that has had a big impact on all our lives, also on our public spaces. Mary and Adnan, I don't know who of you wants to take that. How do you see the impact of this pandemic on the way we live, we experience, we plan, design our public spaces now or moving forward?
Can I go first? Marianne, is that okay? Yeah. All right. So one of the most interesting aspects of the Tatarstan project, the public spaces development project, to me was how it kind of fostered local talents, how it kind of empowered local designers to imagine the spaces they want, the spaces they could create for their people. So I think that's a very important lesson to be learned from the, to be applied to the post-pandemic urbanity, if you will, that how do we imagine very localized spaces? How do we capture very local aspiration in addressing very kind of localized challenges faced by communities during the pandemic? I mean, there is no one panacea for post-pandemic urbanism, as we have seen. We have seen that the pandemic has experienced by different communities very differently. And I tend to give example of the Bronx. You know, Bronx is less dense than Manhattan, but more people died in the Bronx because of its lack of public health, lack of good quality hospital, quality healthcare. So I think one of the lessons that we can learn from particularly the public spaces development program in Tatarstan, that how do we empower local designers, local design communities to address the problems their communities face. So I think that would be a great lesson to be learned. But the other lesson that I think would be very valuable, although making this connection to post-pandemic urbanism and the two projects would rather be superfluous, but I think there are lessons to be learned if you look at the siting of the project, different public spaces projects in Tatarstan, that they are not all in cities. Some of them are in rural areas. So in a way, that project blurs the boundary of rural and urban. And I think that's a great way of reconceptualizing the project, that oftentimes when we think about public spaces, we think about towns and cities. But public spaces can also galvanize rural communities. Public spaces can also reshape the imagination and aspiration of rural communities. And it can create good societies in rural areas. So the Tatarstan project is a great example of how to blur the kind of the false boundary between rural and urban. And perhaps that would be a great way of conceptualizing post-pandemic response to urban challenges.
That's a really interesting point. You brought up capacity building, and that's actually one of the questions that came up on our Q&A as well. So I want to pose this to all of the three panelists here. What efforts in these kind of projects are made to build capacity? You've mentioned, Adnan, the Tatarstan project, but I wonder also in your own experience, our viewer asks, can any of the panelists speak to something unique or meaningful that they have gained or learned or brought into their contemporary practice by partnering with in-country design organizations, firms, or civil society partners in these types of interventions?
I would say that I think that as a designer, an urban designer that works in international projects and domestic projects, I've always learned from local organizations and design firms, and when working with the planning and design of certain neighborhoods, cities, and districts. And I think one example from my work has been working in the capital city of Kabul, Afghanistan, and then understanding what the needs were from the government, from the Ministry of Urban Development and Housing, and how to really understand how to build capacity and share knowledge with the type of design and planning procurement processes that were emerging. So there tended to be a lot of dialogues and shared knowledge of understanding how to approach certain types of ways in which to even analyze very distinct areas of the city. And then I think that we were part of an understanding of linking or connecting or being part of a consortium of other local organizations who could share their knowledge of being on the ground and their techniques, their methodologies that were, again, I guess, shared with the government agencies. So I think that there's a way in which we can share knowledge and that we can build capacity in different ways. And I think that understanding whose knowledge is being shared and how it's being shared is part of that kind of planning and design thinking.
Thanks, Marianne. We've got perhaps as our last question, one for Brigitte Shim. We asked, one of the tenets of the award is that architects can help people and agencies turn their aspirations into material form, despite local challenges, limited resources, and stringent political conditions. How does the jury of the award evaluate an architect's design process working with communities to help turn the aspirations into material reality? How does the judging process differ from the criteria of architectural excellence or structural innovation?
Well, I think that, again, I would say that the Aga Khan Architecture Award is really unique in the way that the jury actually listens to field reviewers who actually go out to visit the projects themselves. They come back to Geneva and present the work to the jury. When I was on the jury, there was actually a market in Burkina Faso. And in the end, the award was given to the Swiss NGO, to the mayor of the town where this market was, but also we awarded both funds and a kind of recognition to 40 masons who actually learned to become bricklayers on this project. It was actually a self-supporting vault. They had very little wood to use as a kind of formwork. So this had to be a self-supporting structure. Many of the kind of masons who got their license doing this kind of building this market were women who had never done any of this work before, and that the award can actually value both process and participation as well as the final result. And I feel that that for me makes it so unique within the kind of range of all of these award programs globally. It actually really distinguishes itself by actually thinking about the kind of people that realize buildings, this question of quality of life, and how buildings have the capacity to enrich and make a difference in people's everyday lives. And I feel that that's why the conversation is so important around public space and community related to this great program.
Brigitte, thank you. I think this was a wonderful conclusion, actually, of our panel highlighting the specific and special meaning and characteristics of the Aga Khan Award of Architecture. I'd like to conclude our seminar with this. The recording of the seminar will be available on the BSA's website. A big thank you to the three speakers for sharing your views tonight with us. Please, everyone, give a round of applause in any virtual way that you've by now figured out that is possible via Zoom. Thank you to our audience for joining this evening, and to the Boston Society of Architecture and the Aga Khan Council for the United States for hosting this event tonight. And to conclude, I want to announce the next and final webinar that is part of the Architecture in Dialogue series. It is titled Living Heritage, and it will take place in about a month's time on Thursday, July the 22nd. You'll find it on the BSA's calendar. Then we'll be joined by Dr. Ulrich Al-Khamis, Interim Director of the Aga Khan Museum in Toronto. For those of you that have not seen that museum, it's a real gem. I encourage you to go and see it when travel is possible again. We'll also be joined by MIT Professor Azra Akshamea, the director of the MIT Future Heritage Lab and the winner of the 2013 Aga Khan Award for Architecture. Azra's work is also currently exhibited at the Venice Architecture Biennale. We hope you can join us next month for this last event. Thank you and have a good evening.